Before the sun rose over the American frontier, thousands of exhausted cowboys were already awake beside dying campfires, eating breakfasts that most people today would never recognize. These meals were not made for comfort. They were made for survival. On freezing cattle trails, a weak breakfast could mean collapsing in the saddle before noon. Some cowboys ate hardened biscuits dipped in burnt coffee, while others survived on salt pork, beans, and scraps cooked in black iron skillets covered in dust and smoke. Yet hidden inside these forgotten breakfasts is the true story of the American West that Hollywood rarely showed. Tonight, we are uncovering 10 forgotten cowboy breakfasts that once fueled cattle drives, brutal winters, and 12-hour rides across dangerous open land. Some of these meals kept men alive during storms, stampedes, and weeks without proper supplies. Others disappeared completely from American tables as the frontier faded into history. If you enjoy forgotten food stories, lost American traditions, and the real history hidden behind everyday meals, subscribe to America's Lost Recipes and join us for more untold stories from America's kitchens and campfires. Because by the end of this video, you may never look at breakfast the same way again. The first meal many cowboys reached for before sunrise was not eggs or pancakes. It was a heavy iron skillet filled with salt pork and beans, one of the most common breakfasts on cattle drives across the American West. Long before daylight touched the prairie, chuck wagon cooks were already awake beside crackling fires, preparing food that could keep exhausted riders alive through another brutal day on horseback. Salt pork was cheap, heavily preserved, and able to survive weeks without spoiling in the heat. Beans were just as important because they filled empty stomachs and stretched limited supplies across long journeys. Together, they became the backbone of frontier breakfasts from Texas trails to Wyoming cattle camps. Cowboys often joked that beans appeared on the table so often that they could smell them before they even opened their eyes in the morning. The pork was usually sliced thick and fried in its own grease until the edges darkened and curled. Then the beans were poured directly into the same skillet, soaking up every bit of smoky fat left behind. Nothing was wasted on the trail. Every calorie mattered when riders faced 12 or more hours in freezing wind, dust storms, or dangerous river crossings. Many cowboys ate this breakfast while sitting on overturned buckets or bedrolls beside fading campfires. Tin plates burned their hands in winter mornings, while black coffee boiled nearby in dented pots coated with soot. There were no fancy seasonings, no soft restaurant biscuits, and no comfort waiting ahead. This was survival food, built to keep men moving before the sun even climbed over the horizon. Before most cattle drives began moving at dawn, another breakfast filled the cold air with the smell of smoke and burnt flour. Cowboys called them flapjacks, but these were nothing like the soft pancakes served in modern diners today. Trail flapjacks were rough, heavy, and cooked fast over open fires because hungry riders could not afford to waste time waiting for elaborate meals. The batter was usually made from flour, water, baking powder, and sometimes a little sourdough starter carried inside crocks on the chuck wagon. Milk was rare on the trail because it spoiled quickly in the heat, and fresh eggs were considered a luxury once cattle drives moved deep into isolated territory. The cook poured the thick mixture directly onto scorching cast-iron griddles blackened by years of smoke and grease. Cowboys often ate flapjacks with molasses instead of maple syrup. Molasses lasted longer, cost less money, and provided quick energy before long hours in the saddle. Some riders folded strips of fried salt pork directly into the pancakes for extra strength during freezing mornings on the plains. Others soaked the flapjacks in hot coffee when supplies became dangerously low and meals needed to stretch further. The chuck wagon cook carried enormous responsibility during these drives. A bad breakfast could destroy morale before sunrise even arrived. Cowboys remembered good cooks for years because food became one of the few comforts during exhausting weeks filled with dust, storms, injuries, and endless riding. As the fire snapped in the darkness and horses shifted nearby, cowboys ate quickly beside the wagon, knowing the trail would soon swallow them for another unforgiving day across the open American frontier. One of the strangest breakfasts cowboys regularly consumed before sunrise was nothing more than hardened biscuits dropped into steaming black coffee. It sounded miserable to outsiders, Yet on freezing cattle trails, the simple meal became a daily reality for countless riders crossing the American frontier. These biscuits were not soft bakery breads. They were dense, dry, and often baked days earlier inside Dutch ovens buried beneath hot coals. Cowboys called them sinkers because of how quickly they dropped to the bottom of a coffee cup. Left exposed to wind and dust inside chuck wagons, the biscuits became so hard that some riders joked they could break teeth if eaten plain. Coffee solved that problem. Strong cowboy coffee boiled constantly beside campfires, sometimes from before dawn until late at night. Grounds floated freely inside dented pots blackened with soot from years on the trail. There were no paper filters, no cream, and rarely sugar. The coffee tasted bitter, smoky, and harsh, but it helped exhausted cowboys stay awake through brutal mornings in the saddle. Many riders dunked hardened biscuits directly into the hot liquid until they softened enough to chew. It was fast, filling, and required almost no preparation during difficult stretches of cattle drives when supplies ran dangerously thin. Some mornings this was all a cowboy had before riding for hours through rain, mud, or bitter prairie wind. The meal reflected the harsh truth of frontier life. Cowboys did not eat for pleasure most of the time. They ate to survive another day. Before sunrise, while campfires cracked in the darkness and horses stamped against the cold, these simple biscuits and burnt coffee became fuel for one of the hardest jobs in American history. Long before canned breakfast meats and modern diners appeared across America, cowboys depended on thick slices of fried salt pork to begin the day. On isolated cattle trails, this greasy and heavily preserved meat became one of the few reliable foods that could survive weeks without refrigeration under brutal frontier conditions. Salt pork was exactly what its name suggested. Large cuts of pork were packed heavily in salt barrels to prevent spoilage during long journeys across the West. The flavor was powerful, painfully salty, and sometimes tough enough to chew for several minutes. Yet cowboys valued it because it provided desperately needed fat and energy before exhausting rides through open country. Before sunrise, chuck wagon cooks sliced the pork into rough pieces and dropped them into smoking cast-iron skillets over open flames. As the meat fried, thick grease filled the pan and popped loudly in the cold morning air. Cowboys often woke to that sound before they even opened their eyes inside bedrolls spread across the ground nearby. Nothing from the skillet went to waste. Cooks reused the leftover grease for beans, potatoes, biscuits, or cornbread later in the day. Frontier kitchens operated on survival logic, not comfort. Every scrap of food mattered when supply towns could be hundreds of miles away. Some cowboys wrapped fried salt pork inside biscuits for a quick meal they could carry while riding. Others ate it beside onions or cold beans while drinking black coffee strong enough to keep them awake through endless hours in the saddle. The breakfast was simple, harsh, and unforgettable. Smoke drifted into the dark sky while cattle stirred in the distance and tired riders prepared for another dangerous day on the trail. For many cowboys, the smell of frying salt pork became the smell of survival itself. Before dawn settled fully over the frontier, many cowboys gathered around chuck wagons for a breakfast that looked surprisingly simple. Fried potatoes and onions cooked together in thick bacon grease. Yet, on the open cattle trails of the American West, this humble skillet meal became one of the most dependable sources of warmth and strength a rider could hope for before spending the day on horseback. Potatoes were cheap, filling, and easy to transport across long distances without spoiling quickly. Onions lasted well on the trail too, even during difficult weather. Together, they formed a practical breakfast that could feed large groups of hungry cowboys with limited supplies. Chuck wagon cooks often carried sacks of both ingredients hanging from the sides of the wagon beside coffee beans, flour, and dried meat. The potatoes were chopped roughly and dropped into sizzling grease while it was still dark outside. Onions followed moments later, filling the cold morning air with a sharp, smoky smell that spread through the camp. Cowboys sleeping beside nearby fires often woke immediately when they heard the skillet begin to crackle. Some cooks mixed leftover salt pork or scraps of beef into the pan whenever supplies allowed. Others added nothing at all because every extra ingredient had to be rationed carefully across long cattle drives that could last months. Cowboys usually ate this meal quickly from tin plates balanced on their knees while horses waited nearby in the darkness. There was little conversation before sunrise. Most riders were tired, cold, and already thinking about the endless miles ahead. Still, for a few quiet moments beside the campfire, hot potatoes and onions offered something rare on the frontier. They provided warmth, comfort, and the feeling that another difficult day could somehow be endured across the vast and unforgiving American West. One breakfast that quietly disappeared from American memory was sourdough biscuits cooked beside campfires before sunrise. For many cowboys, these rough biscuits were more valuable than almost anything packed inside the chuck wagon because fresh bread on the frontier was difficult to make without reliable yeast or refrigeration. Instead, trail cooks depended on sourdough starter carried carefully across hundreds of miles in crocks, jars, or cloth-covered containers. Cowboys sometimes joked about the starter as if it were another member of the crew because losing it could ruin meals for days. A healthy sourdough mixture allowed cooks to prepare bread almost anywhere, even deep in isolated cattle country far from towns or supply posts. Before dawn, flour, water, and starter were mixed into heavy dough and shaped quickly by hand. The biscuits were placed inside cast-iron Dutch ovens surrounded by hot coals, while cowboys rolled bedrolls nearby and prepared saddles in the darkness. Smoke drifted across the prairie as the smell of baking bread slowly filled the cold morning air. These biscuits were dense and sturdy rather than soft and fluffy. Cowboys often split them open and filled them with fried pork, beans, or leftover beef from the night before. Others dipped them directly into black coffee to soften the crust after long days exposed to dry wind and dust. A fresh batch of sourdough biscuits could lift morale across an exhausted cattle camp. On difficult trails, good food became emotional comfort as much as physical survival. Riders remembered skilled chuck wagon cooks for years because simple meals often determined whether a crew faced the day with strength or frustration. While the frontier disappeared long ago, the smell of sourdough baking before sunrise once signaled another hard day beginning across the American West. Before sunrise, when the prairie was still wrapped in darkness, another forgotten cowboy breakfast came from the chuck wagon. Dried beef cooked into a simple gravy. On long cattle drives, fresh meat was rare, so cooks relied on preserved strips of beef that could survive weeks of heat, dust, and travel without spoiling. This dried beef was heavily salted and air-cured until it became tough and leathery. Cowboys often called it jerky meat, and it could be chewed as it was, but most preferred it softened in hot water or cooked in a skillet. The goal was never flavor alone. It was nourishment strong enough to carry a rider through endless miles of hard labor. Before dawn, the cook would slice the beef into thin shreds and drop it into a pan of boiling water or grease. As it simmered, the meat slowly loosened and released a strong, smoky aroma that drifted through the sleeping camp. Some cooks added flour to thicken the mixture into a rough gravy, which could be poured over biscuits or eaten straight from tin plates. Cowboys valued this breakfast because it felt warmer and more substantial than plain jerky. On freezing mornings, when frost clung to saddles and horses stamped impatiently in the cold, even a simple bowl of hot meat and gravy felt like comfort earned through hardship. Nothing about this meal was refined. It was practical, fast, and designed for survival on the trail. Every bite reflected the harsh reality of frontier life, where food was judged not by taste, but by its ability to keep a man moving until the next sunrise broke over the endless American plains. Another forgotten breakfast that fueled cowboys before sunrise was a simple bowl of oatmeal cooked over open flames, often enriched with whatever fat the chuck wagon could spare. On the frontier, oatmeal was valued because it was cheap, easy to store, and capable of feeding large crews without requiring complicated preparation. Before dawn, cooks would pour oats into boiling water inside blackened pots hanging over campfires. The mixture thickened quickly, turning into a heavy porridge that could warm exhausted riders in the cold morning air. There was rarely sugar available, and milk was almost unheard of on long cattle drives, so the taste was plain and earthy. To make it more filling, cowboys often added a spoonful of lard or leftover bacon grease. This small addition increased calories needed for long hours in the saddle and helped the body resist freezing winds on open plains. In some camps, dried fruit or scraps of preserved meat were mixed in when supplies allowed, but most mornings were far simpler. Cowboys ate this breakfast quickly, usually sitting on overturned buckets or directly on the ground near the wagons. Steam rose from tin bowls as horses shifted in the darkness and the first hints of daylight appeared on the horizon. Conversation was minimal because energy was conserved for the long ride ahead. Despite its simplicity, oatmeal carried an important role in frontier survival. It was steady fuel in a world where food was unpredictable and travel was harsh. Each bowl represented preparation for another demanding day across unforgiving land, where endurance mattered more than comfort and sunrise always arrived with work already waiting. Before the first light reached the horizon, cowboys often prepared another practical breakfast that has nearly been forgotten. Skillet cornbread cooked directly in cast iron over open flames. On long cattle drives, this simple bread became a reliable way to feed large crews quickly without requiring complicated ingredients or long preparation time. Cornmeal was one of the most important supplies carried in the chuck wagon. It stored well, traveled easily, and could be transformed into bread, cakes, or thick porridge depending on what the trail allowed. When mixed with water, salt, and a small amount of baking soda or powder, it became a thick batter ready for the skillet. Before sunrise, cooks would pour the mixture into greased cast iron pans and place them directly beside hot coals. The edges hardened first, forming a crust that could withstand rough handling. The center stayed soft and dense, perfect for hungry riders who needed quick energy before mounting their horses. Bacon grease was often used to coat the skillet, adding both flavor and calories. In some camps, leftover bits of salt pork or dried meat were pressed into the batter to make it more filling. Nothing on the trail was wasted if it could be used for fuel. Cowboys ate cornbread by breaking it into chunks and dipping it into coffee or beans. It was simple, filling, and easy to carry while riding long distances across open land. The meal did not depend on taste or presentation. It existed because survival demanded it. As the sky slowly brightened and cattle began to stir, skillet cornbread represented another quiet truth of frontier life. Every sunrise required strength, and every meal was part of surviving the endless journey across the American West. As the final darkness of night lingered over the cattle camps, one of the last forgotten cowboy breakfasts to emerge before sunrise was the chuck wagon scramble. A rough mixture of eggs, leftover meat, and whatever ingredients remained from the previous day. It was not planned, and it was never consistent, but it became one of the most practical ways to feed exhausted cowhands on the frontier. Eggs were rare on long drives, usually carried in limited supply or collected when ranch stops allowed. When available, they were broken directly into a hot cast iron skillet already coated with grease from salt pork or bacon. Into the same pan went small pieces of dried beef, beans, potatoes, or cornbread scraps left over from earlier meals. The cook worked quickly because sunrise meant movement. Horses had to be saddled, cattle gathered, and trails resumed before the heat of the day set in. The scramble sizzled loudly over open flames while cowboys gathered silently around the wagon, waiting with tin plates in hand. There was no recipe, no measurement, and no consistency. Each batch depended entirely on what remained in storage. Some mornings it was rich and filling, while other days it was thin and barely enough to share among a full crew of riders. Yet this unpredictable meal reflected the reality of frontier life more than anything else. Cowboys ate what they had, when they had it, and moved on without complaint because the trail never waited for comfort. As the sun finally rose over the wide American plains, the chuck wagon scramble marked the end of another night of survival. Breakfast was never about luxury. It was about endurance, and the road ahead always demanded more than the night could give. Before the camps fell silent and the last embers of the fire faded into ash, these forgotten breakfasts tell a story far beyond food. They reveal a world where sunrise did not mean comfort or routine, but responsibility, exhaustion, and survival carved into every mile of the American frontier. Cowboys did not begin their day with choice. They began it with necessity. Every skillet meal, every bitter sip of coffee, and every hardened biscuit carried the weight of long journeys across land that offered little mercy. What remains today is not just history, but a reminder of how endurance once defined daily life. If you want more forgotten meals, lost traditions, and unsettling truths hidden inside everyday history, Subscribe to America's Lost Recipes and stay with us as we continue uncovering stories that time tried to erase. Because sometimes the most ordinary meal holds the most extraordinary history.